some Chinese pensioners and some Chinese government employees in Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities are not receiving checks. So yesterday I received some information from a podcast listener, Maggie, who monitors Chinese social media and also the Twitter feed that's in Chinese, in Mandarin, or also Cantonese for me, and she sent me some new information. And this tweet that's appearing on your screen there, that is from someone, and yes, he's using an alias. However, this person lives in Hong Kong, and what they do on their Twitter feed is they translate information from either Cantonese or Mandarin into English. And yesterday, in pensioners in Wuchang, Guangdong province, which is supposedly Guangdong province is one of the richest provinces in all of mainland China, and they were protesting that they had not received checks for their pensions. And I'm hearing that this is sometimes common. Also, if you think that this is inaccurate, because I know there's people out there that think that this is not true, there's video. So on his Twitter feed, there is actually video of the protesters. So if you want to go there's the tweet. You can look it up yourself on his Twitter from yesterday, from September 18th. Also, I received recently another longtime listener. I'm not going to name his name because they didn't give me permission, but he has family and friends in mainland China, and he has told me that now he has heard from family and friends that government employees, and this seems to be pervasive according to him, that government employees in Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities, so not Tier 1 cities like Shanghai or Beijing, but Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities, they are not getting paid. At least some of them are not getting paid, have not received checks. Some of them for 6 months or longer, at least 6 months. So I have tried to, as of right now, I would just call that rumors because I've only heard that from one source with family and friends in China. And I reached out to my contact, Emma Molman, who has an extensive network of contacts in mainland China and also Hong Kong, and she was able through one of her sources to partially confirm that apparently that government employees sometimes are not paid in different provinces, and it can be for a month or two. It depends. Now remember, Michael Pettis put out a tweet on September 8th. He has lived in China for over a decade. He's a successful businessman. He worked on Wall Street. He's lived in mainland China for over a decade. He's a Peking University senior associate professor. He's a finance professor there, also worked on Wall Street. And he put out a tweet saying there was a story from Caixin Global that state-owned enterprises are told to pay your bills on time because the state-owned enterprises have not been paying their bills on time. So he put out a tweet earlier this month saying it's not just state-owned enterprises who have been delaying payments, but also many municipalities have been paying teachers, suppliers, and civil servants late. He didn't say exactly how late, but he says this piling up of payables should, but typically doesn't show up in the aggregate debt numbers. So when you add these things up, guys, there are a lot of problems in China, just like there are a lot of problems everywhere else. I love Catherine Austin Fitts. I think she's one of the smartest people in all the financial community, but she said she acts like there's no problems in China or Asia. She acts like there's no problems in Chinese banks, and I completely and totally disagree with her. I completely and totally disagree with Peter Schiff. If what she was saying were true, we would not have seen the story that came out in July of China Construction Bank, which was one of the two largest banks in all of China, agreed to a $291 billion bailout to support Hunan province over 5 years. So it says, quote, comprehensive financing support to central China's Hunan province over the next 5 years. According to the local government, the country's second largest lender by assets has signed a pact to deepen strategic cooperation with the Hunan government on Wednesday, the provincial government said in a statement on its website. The financing support will help, quote, promote the high-quality development of manufacturing industry, foster and strengthen key enterprises and little giant enterprises, and prevent and resolve local government hidden desk risks, it said. That press release sounds like a bunch of bullshit. If you want to cut through it, it's a bailout. Okay? You have the large Chinese banks bailing out the local governments now. You have the large Chinese state-owned enterprise banks. That I have new articles from Reuters with Chinese sources quoting Chinese bankers from the end of August saying that as new policy, the People's Bank of China and the Chinese government wants the larger banks to totally buy out and is engineering bailouts of the smaller banks. And they're hoping that that will offset some of the risks. That the larger banks swallowing up the smaller banks will prevent any more banking crisis. Rob, it's on Twitter. I don't know how many. This is why I have a large podcast audience. It's called Crowdsource the Truth. If other people have other sources or contacts in mainland China, they can email me at wallstreetformainstreet@gmail.com. That's the abbreviation one, WALLSTFORMAINST@gmail.com. And they can either confirm or deny or add more information to that. They can crowdsource the truth. But that is a major province in China where pensioners, that is the equivalent of here in the United States, people on Social Security not getting their checks. Okay? To put that into proper perspective, that is the equivalent of people here in the United States on Social Security not getting their checks. Okay, pensioners. Serious stuff. Government employees. Either state-owned enterprises not paying their bills because they have a dollar shortage, they have debt problems. And then local governments, teachers not getting paid. Local governments not paying teachers. Local governments not paying their employees. It is a mess. And then you have the pork problems, and that is why, and I've covered the pork problems, and that is why China recently just eliminated the tariffs, lowered or eliminated, I believe eliminated the tariffs on American pork and American soybeans, because they are, so far according to my sources, there is no civil unrest over food protests yet. So people are switching from pork to other meat or not eating meat, and they're substituting other things because the price of pork is too high, the price of chicken is going up, certain vegetables, the prices are going up. And so far there's not civil unrest, but China's running around scrambling. Now, I want to cover this. I said in another podcast recently that China may not actually have the 50 million tons or more of frozen pork reserves, the strategic pork reserves, the other SPR. Apparently, I've spoken to a number of people on this and read sources and spoken to a number of different people I trust, as well as read different articles on China, like I said. And China does have a strategic pork reserve. However, it's more complicated than that. So the lower end estimates is that there's 50 million tons of frozen pork that China has, but the CIA here in the US, and thank you, Fred, for sending me the email. I'm not sure why Fred's emailing me so many articles all the time, if he's just pro-China or China apologist, or if he's actually assigned to my channel by the Chinese government. I'm not actually sure why Fred emails me all the time, all those articles. But thank you, Fred, for sending me the information. The CIA fact book says that China has 75 million to 100 million tons of pork. But from what I've heard from my sources who have contacts in mainland China or people in mainland China tell me the information, there is little or zero demand for the frozen pork in the China pork reserves. In the frozen pork, Chinese only want fresh pork. So China has wasted massive, massive amounts of pork. And there's these articles coming out today, actually, from Reuters, that China is going to release more meat from the state reserves to secure supplies, that they're releasing another 10,000 tons of pork from their reserves on Thursday to secure meat supply during National Day holiday. And from what I hear from my sources in mainland China, there is no demand for the frozen pork. So all that pork has been wasted. They're both bad. They're both bad. This is why I don't like governments, Mr. Fatface. They're both bad. This is why you can't trust governments. I don't like any of the governments. None of the governments are doing a good job. So there's lots of evidence when you add up the circumstantial evidence and the other news stories that have come out for months now about the Chinese banking system, about the bailouts from large Chinese banks of Hunan province, and other stories that have come out with how China's handling bailouts, about their dollar shortage and others. I've covered this extensively. No other source, not even China Uncensored, and I love the coverage of China Uncensored. They present information in a very easy to understand and often funny way with some satire mixed in. However, they do not have the business experience or market experience. They have no analyst there who has any business or market or finance or market experience there, because I've seen them conduct interviews and they just don't ask the right questions. So I'm not sure if they're getting the information, the same information I am, or they're just not interpreting it correctly. And obviously the gold community, unfortunately, most of the people in the gold community have, a lot of them have the Peter Schiff viewpoint that China's in much better shape. So China has lifted, as of right now, the tariffs on soybeans and pork, and that is to prevent civil unrest and food prices and to bring in more supply. And also because they've wasted, with this frozen pork reserve, there is no real demand for it. So even though China, and Fred has emailed me all these sources saying that China has over 50 million tons of pork reserves, of strategic pork reserves, of frozen pork reserves, that there's no demand for China's frozen pork reserves. So unfortunately, they've wasted all that pork. It's just truly sad. So if anyone has any more information, can confirm that many government employees in Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities have not been paid for a month, 2 months. I'm hearing 6 months or more now from one of my longtime loyal podcast listeners who has family and friends in all over mainland China. Fill that in. I've tried to confirm it with other sources. Emma Molman was kind enough to get me some information on that, and that this does periodically happen, but she was surprised to hear that anyone was saying it was longer than 6 months. It was 6 months or longer. China has also managed to, on the dollar to yuan exchange rate, they have also managed to prevent their currency from weakening too quickly against the dollar. It got to 7.179 yuan to the dollar, and they've got it down below 7.1. So it was, let me see here, today's exchange rate. It is 7.096 around there right now. So they have probably had to load on the derivatives. There was another Reuters article that came out with sources, again, from Chinese banks that came out at the end of August, that China was loading on even more forward dollar swaps. So my guess is my educated guess is that China has has massively increased, massively layered on their derivatives position of forward dollar swaps to try to stabilize their currency. Thank you for the super chat, Jim. Yeah, the trade war is hurting everyone. Jim, did you see what happened to FedEx? FedEx announced earnings today, and actually yesterday, and they were really, really bad. FedEx lowered their guidance a lot for future earnings for the rest of 2019 and 2020, and their stock price, I think, is down a lot. I didn't check how much it's down. I could take a look really quick and see. Let me just look it up real quick. Wow, their stock price gapped down. So their stock price before their earnings announcement was 173.61, and it dropped as low as 149.35. The 5-day chart, it looks like the stock just straight up took the elevator down. So FedEx is a leading economic indicator, as I was telling you guys. FedEx is a leading economic indicator because they ship goods all over the world. And if traffic, the amount of goods they ship, is dropping and their earnings are dropping, that's a leading economic indicator that the global economy is getting even worse. I've also heard, and I have not been able to confirm this yet either, so I'm reporting this now just as a rumor because it's only one person, so I'll read you what I was sent. Let me pull it up here. Give me a second. So someone sent me that people in Hong Kong who tried to transfer funds out of BMO Bank in Hong Kong to another country, that the government there had intercepted, that the mainland Chinese government had intercepted the funds going out of the country, and some funds are not showing as received from sender to destination. So right now, I'm just saying that that's a rumor. I have not gotten multiple confirmations of that. So I'm just reporting that as a rumor. The government employees not getting paid, based on the Michael Pettis tweets and the bailouts from China Construction Bank that have occurred, that sounds to be increasing pervasively throughout China, though. So not necessarily in Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities, but Hunan Province, and now pensioners are not getting paid in Guangdong Province. Scary stuff, guys. They need to thaw it out. They need to thaw out the frozen pork first, but there's no guarantee that the Chinese consumer will want the meat anyway. So all that meat, $7.82, it might have been wasted. If all that strategic pork reserves were going to really help, why was China scrambling then to secure a supply of beef cattle in Australia, Brazil, supplies of goats all over the world, supplies of lamb and sheep all over the world? So they were scrambling for the last month or so to try to deal with their pork problems. So the new bailout strategy, guys, is going to be the larger Chinese banks. The Chinese government and the People's Bank of China are trying to engineer the larger banks buy out the smaller ones and hope that puts out any of the problems with the smaller banks. I'm not sure that that's going to work. Because remember, even when Wells Fargo bought Wachovia and JP Morgan bought Bear Stearns and Bank of America bought Merrill Lynch, etc., that the U.S. government still had to guarantee a lot of things. The Federal Reserve still had to, the Congress still had to do TARP, $800 billion plus of TARP. And on top of that, they still had to do the emergency currency swaps. So someone who asked me an interesting question, what's worse, these news stories in China or the emergency liquidity programs, the repos, repo madness. I like repo madness better than repocalypse. I like repo madness better. Guys, at repo madness, we're up to $300 billion in emergency liquidity programs in 4 days. So freaking nuts. But there are problems everywhere. It is now a question, and I've been saying this for a while, now a question of what collapses first and then the chain reaction after that. Larry Kudlow says the tariffs are going to 100%. Well, I think, Jack, that 100% of Chinese goods coming into the U.S. are already tariffed. So there might have been some exceptions, but Trump already planned on putting 100% of the tariffs. The new one that I saw, the new story that I saw is there's about to be more tariffs, I think, on the European Union goods to protect Boeing and other companies. So I may cover that in the near future. Oh, and the other stories that corroborate that the government workers are not getting paid, before I forget to mention this, there was the New York Times article, I think, out in early August about circulating in China's financial system more than $200 billion in IOUs. So there is a lot of Chinese businessmen, a lot of Chinese workers that have done work, provided goods or services, and are unpaid. So there's not 200 billion yuan, $200 billion worth of IOUs circulating in the Chinese economy. So that would also add, if there's that many IOUs, that would also make sense that not only are state-owned enterprises not paying their bills, that government employees are not, especially in Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities, and pensioners are not a priority. That's how I would interpret a lot of this stuff. Illinois is a mess, Jack. Illinois is a mess. The politicians in Illinois, the Chicago political machine, Illinois political machine, Illinois is a disaster. There are problems everywhere. Okay, you have people in the gold community saying that U.S. problems are the only problems that matter. There's problems all over Europe, European Union, enormous problems. China, enormous problems. Emerging markets, enormous problems. Corporate bond market here in the U.S., enormous problems. I just got from a brave insider at one of the ratings agencies, I just got copies of internal documents of the collateralized loan obligations and how they raid this junk. Like the truth. Like the internal document stuff. I'm not even sure if I should go into detail or show you guys any pictures about this. Some of the stuff in the internal documents, nuts. Because I've been covering collateralized loan obligations and someone's listening to my podcast, they didn't want to be named. I just got from someone inside the one of the 3 ratings agencies, I just got copies of internal documents of how the CLOs are rated, and it is bad. These things are by far, the CLOs are by far the new ninja loans. No income, no job, no asset loans. If you remember those from 2008, they were the worst of the worst subprime. These CLOs, these covenant light, junk bonds, these things are so bad they don't even have a rating. They don't even have a rating, so they're assigned a rating. They're not even worth a rating, and they're assigned a rating anyway. Oh, I'm not snitching on my friend. I didn't name any names. I didn't name anywhere the guy works or girl works. But I have a copy of the document. Crazy stuff. CLOs are all AAA plus rated, of course. So the bottom line is problems in China are getting worse. This is why China wants a trade deal, it sounds like. They're being more amenable to a trade deal. Not that China's going to live up to the trade deal anyway. Okay, so let me see if I mentioned everything that I wanted to mention. And this is not financial advice, but this is why I want to own some cash in case there's a stock market crash and something I like goes on sale, some dollars. I have those for emergency and for optionality in case something does crash. And then also I own physical gold and silver, and then I own a little bit of Bitcoin. And then I own some really well-researched gold and silver stocks. I don't own everything. If you don't know how to research them yourself, the gold stock ETFs, not financial advice, but the gold stock ETFs are pretty good. They'll give you a basket and exposure. Things are going to get very, very bad shortly. If you think things are bad now, the next 6 to 12 months are probably going to accelerate. Hey, Jim, it sounds like you put some analysis there about FedEx, Jim Phillips did, in the comment section. In the live chat comments, it sounds like FedEx did a bad acquisition at a bad time. The first thing they should do, what should broke job seekers do now? The first thing they should do is they need to hustle. They need to figure out how to get money coming in from a couple different places. If you don't have money to buy gold and silver, you need to figure out how to grow your revenues. There's a book out that's not too expensive called 100 Side Hustles. Start there. What skills do you have? So while the gold community criticizes me and some people call me a crypto pumper and a bunch of other stupid names, I'm breaking stories. I'm China Uncensored, and I love China Uncensored. Covers China full time. That's their day job. They actually make enough money to do this full time, and I'm breaking stories that they're not talking about. They didn't talk at all about the HSBC Bank stuff or any of the other stuff. They're not covering or analyzing any of this information. No analysis there. And that's because I have a business and investing market experience. I've worked in the financial industry now, different jobs for a decade. Taylor says government officials are looting from city revenue to pay for Illinois firefighters' pension right now. Third pension domino to fall in that area. Yeah, I'm not surprised, Taylor. The politicians also overpromised cushy retirements for government employees, teachers, firemen, policemen in exchange for votes. It was mathematically not possible for everyone to have 80% of their retirement with all that pension fund money reinvested. To assume 8% per year compound annual growth rates is very, very unlikely. And the corruption and the other problems in China too. There's corruption everywhere. It's a bull market in global corruption. It's a mess. His Twitter handle, okay, so Bob Smith asked, what is the Chinese translator's Twitter handle? His Twitter handle is WB Yates. So at WB, so Warner Brothers, WB, and then Yates, Yeats, 1865. So hat tip to Maggie for getting me that information. I appreciate it. Yeah, the repo market is still messed up. Rob says, if that's true, that pensioners are not receiving checks, then that's the beginning of the end for the Chinese Communist Party. Rob, I would say that depends on how many provinces, how many cities and provinces are not getting their checks. So I have confirmation of the one there in a pretty large province. So according to this guy, let me pull up his tweet again. So according to this guy, the province Guangdong used to be the richest province in all of China until 2018, and he checked the latest figures from the first half of 2019, and Guangdong went into they have a big budget deficit. So Guangdong went from having the most profitable, and he's translating it here. He has charts and graphs in Chinese that he's translated for us, and he's saying that Guangdong used to be run a big surplus until 2018, and now they're running a huge government budget deficit. And he says only Shanghai, a municipality, has a tiny surplus in the first half of 2019. Every other Chinese local government or province is running a big budget deficit. That's what he's saying on his Twitter. I haven't double-checked that, but that's what he's saying on his Twitter. So, Rob, it depends how pervasive that is. It depends how pervasive. So there are protests. If you do a lot of research and you watch ADV China videos or Serpensa videos or Lawai86 or China Uncensored videos, you will see that Chinese real estate companies, when they finish a building, if some people paid full price for a condo or a house or an apartment, and then the builder starts discounting those, then there will be big protests. So if the people see that they paid full price for an apartment or condo or a house, and then the builder starts discounting those, then there's protests for those too. And those have been pervasive for a while. But there's also protests all over China because there's a ton of peer-to-peer lending scams, and there's a ton of a lot of other scams that turn out to be Ponzi schemes, and then the Chinese government doesn't really do anything. No one goes to prison. The company that stole the money in the peer-to-peer lending scam, and those are pervasive, they run away with the money, and no one, the people are not made whole. Like, say what you want about the U.S., but the Madoff victims ended up getting at least what they originally invested, they got back. So, yes, the money was probably printed, but the Madoff victims at least got... So they didn't get their statement numbers. They didn't get all the returns that they were supposed to get for 20 or 30 years. As a libertarian, I don't like that. I don't like any government doing that because people should take personal responsibility for their investment screw-ups, but I don't get a vote. So the government just steps in, and here in the United States, they make people whole. So it is what it is. As a libertarian, I don't like it, but I don't get to say that it shouldn't be done. But in China, they don't do that. So if someone creates a scam, like a peer-to-peer lending scam, and those are very common in China, and there's a lot of problems with wealth management products and other things, other investments that go bad in China, or other frauds and scams with the China hustle, and the company steals the money from investors and leaves, people don't go to prison, and the investors then protest outside of Chinese government offices, and no one gets any bailout money or any retribution or anything. Santana says this time everyone's going to get... Well, I won't cuss, but this time everyone's going to get screwed over. He doesn't think anyone gets out whole. Yeah, I think we're heading towards that way. But everything is in stagflate and tax and lie anyway, especially here in the U.S. and the European Union and Japan. So, and the United Kingdom, all those areas are all in stagflate and tax and lie, where they're all underreporting inflation, creating new taxes, layering on new taxes. Even this universal basic income, which I think suckers are actually going to vote for, they don't realize that all the taxes on everything they consume and taxes on everyone else are going to go through the roof to fund that. That would put the U.S. into an additional $3 trillion per year, over $3 trillion in budget deficit. Spartacus in Thracian says his wife's family are pensioners in Guangdong and Heilongjiang. Well, there's video. There's video of the protests. There's video of that protest. So I don't think he just made up the tweet. There's actual video of the protesters, and he translated what they're saying. The protesters are saying, Wuchan Pension Fund Bureau, pay me back my pension. And that's all they're repeating. The tweet was from yesterday, September 18th. You can look it up yourself. I'll put a link to the tweet in the information and description section if you want to look at it later. So just more craziness, the repo stuff, the emergency liquidity programs and the repos craziness. Let me look at the dollar index. Meanwhile, the dollar index is still at 98.33, acting like there's not that big a deal. And the VIX is down to 14, despite the emergency liquidity programs, $300 billion of repos in only 4 days. Rigged. Dystopian. It's Heilongjiang. Okay. I'll cover the repo again maybe tomorrow or the next day. We'll see. Guys, the repo exploding like this precedes, as I said yesterday, on yesterday's video, it precedes quantitative easing and normally another crisis. And we don't know what the Fed is buying from the banks. So we don't know if they're buying treasuries or if the Fed is buying collateralized loan obligations. Because normally with the repos, in better times, like I said, it's supposed to be treasuries, good collateral. However, in 2008, before the Fed officially started QE, the Fed was buying back the most toxic stuff on repos. And the banks and all the talking heads and the mainstream financial media, all the Wall Street people that benefit off the status quo were like, oh, the banks will buy them back. Oh, the banks can buy them back. It's not debt monetization. It's not, the central bank's not creating currency out of thin air. Oh, the banks can have, it's a repurchase agreement. It's not inflationary. The banks can buy everything back. And guess how much of the toxic garbage the banks bought back? Probably close to zero. And the central bank also paid full price for assets in air quotes, mortgage-backed securities and other garbage in 2008, other derivatives that were worth zero. So repo is emergency liquidity. It is similar to QE. It's technically not QE. If you tell a financial professional who's not Austrian school economics and libertarian that repo is QE, they're going to say it's not QE. They did the same thing in 2007 and 8 when the repo started to really spike. So repo spiking like this will almost definitely precede QE. There was a short squeeze in palladium. The lease rates. My friend David Jansen, Douglas, read David Jansen's work. He's on Twitter and also writes at safehaven.com. He was talking the lease rates on palladium. What happened with palladium was Putin, this was like 3 or 4 years ago, Vladimir Putin realized that the Wall Street and London bankers were manipulating the palladium market a lot, and they were doing similar games to the silver market. And so the largest palladium producer, I believe in Russia, announced that they were just stopping delivery of palladium to the London Metal Exchange, to LBMA and London Metals Exchange. And so the palladium stopped, and then, yes, David, there's not 2 S's, I think it's 1 S. He was writing about this. So the lease rates on palladium went absolutely crazy for physical metal. But basically there was a big supply shortage because the largest producer, one of the largest producers of palladium in the entire world, stopped delivering physical metal to the metals exchanges in London. So initially, Douglas, the palladium price did not go up, and it took some time, but in the last year and a half, the palladium price started to move. It took about 2 years because there was still some palladium in the warehouses, but then that's the correct spelling. But then the palladium eventually ran out. They ran out of palladium in the warehouses. So there was a big short squeeze in palladium. There was a lack of supply in the metals warehouses on the futures exchanges. Yeah, it was a very smart move by Russia. That was one of their most brilliant moves in the last couple years. Yeah, they closed down that, they either shut down production or just, they either closed down the mine or they announced that they were stopped delivering to the metals exchanges in London. Okay, Matthias asks a question, is the repo situation somehow normal in a healthy economy? Small amounts of repo, So smaller amounts of, I don't know, tens of billions, maybe 100 billion in a month. Because the banks do this overnight lending and repo. It could be a short overnight loan for a derivatives trade or something along those lines. But when the repos spike, then it gets crazy. So there's a really good chart showing the repo market back through 2000, and it shows the big spikes prior to the 2001 tech crash and 2008 financial crisis, and the big spikes of the repo. We're getting there. So our repos today more or less in 2007. So if I remember correctly, I don't have the chart up right now. Eric, thank you for the super chat. If I remember correctly, from 2007, it was 300 billion per month for a while in 2007, and we just did 300 billion now in repos in 4 days. So let's see if this continues, because 2007, that was months and months and months. It was consistently from 200 billion per month up to 250 billion, up to 300 billion, then for a while to 300, stayed at 300 billion, and up to 350, then up to 400 billion. I think it got to 450 billion for 1 or 2 months, almost to 500 billion. And then that's when the Fed just said, we can't do this anymore. We have to just step in and do QE. So you have to monitor this. Guys, we've only had the repo spike. We've only had the repo spike for 4 days. So it's too early. We have to see this, what happens in the over a month, over the next month. So if it's staying at high, if the repo, the way I would monitor the repo situation is, not financial advice, just my opinion, is if it stays at the hundreds of billions of dollar level for the next month or two and goes higher, then we're heading into the crisis zone. That something is collapsing somewhere. Yesterday, so all the China apologists, gold community people who want to blame, who want to say that the U.S. only has all the problems in the global economy, they were all saying yesterday that this has to be with the Treasury market, but I'm not so sure. Maybe it is. But they were adamant that it is with the Treasury market, that there was a Treasury market default. But Victor Sperandio has written articles about this over the last year about hold to maturity accounts. So the primary dealers can buy a ton of these treasuries and not have to take any losses. So I think with that in place, if Victor Sperandio is right, then all the problems with the repo market are not all U.S. Treasury problems, like a no-bid Treasury auction or anything like that. And my best guess would be problems in the derivatives market or problems with European banks. Because I think the way things worked in 2008 is any European bank with an American subsidiary got access to the Fed discount window too. So I believe that I haven't seen anything that contradicts this, that any European bank that's in trouble with an American subsidiary, locations here in the U.S., so Deutsche Bank headquarters in New York City, Credit Suisse headquarters in New York City, UBS headquarters in New York City, they have access to the Fed's discount window, which means they have access to Fed programs like repo and others. That would be my educated guess, that it could be that there are big problems in the European Union banks, which is very predictable, and that they're using access to the Fed's discount window and other things. Programs. You want a link to the Chinese protest? Okay, let me see if I can pull it up here. I'll put that in the live chat section since you... Okay, Jason, Free Living Project says, Jason, big banks are running out of excess reserves. Well, this is because the Federal Reserve has lowered the interest on excess reserves, and then the bank said, why do we need to keep cash here in excess reserves? And they moved it out. So the Fed, when they cut interest rates, when they did the rate cut, they also lowered IOER, which is interest on excess reserves. And of course, the banks then are not going to keep the excess reserves at the Fed. They're going to start making loans, bets, gambles, speculations in the derivatives market. Got the link to the tweet with the protest from the pensioners in Guangdong province is in the live chat section if you guys want to take a look. Sean, who can lower capital reserves to free up cash? Are you talking about China? Because China did lower bank reserves. I don't like lowering capital reserves. I think it's dangerous because you're giving the bank more rope to hang itself with. You're giving the bank the ability to do more fractional reserve lending and have less cash in reserves. So hopefully we can crowdsource because my podcast is getting larger. Thank you to my almost 150 Patreon account contributors. I'm busting my butt, guys. I think I've had 1 day off from doing content in the last 4 or 5 months now. It's been a lot. It's been a while. I could use a day off. But things are starting to really roll here. I have almost 150 Patreon account contributors, around a dozen monthly PayPal account contributors, so things are starting to roll. Unfortunately, though, YouTube censorship is picking up, and my channel was growing at 2,000 new subscribers per month, and over the last 3 or 4 weeks, it's down to almost 0. Okay, guys, well, I think that's it for now. So when you combine the stories that I mentioned earlier with the New York Times, 200 billion in IOU circulating, and there's extensive details in that story, along with how one of China's 2 largest state-owned enterprise banks is providing around $300 billion in bailout money to Hunan province, it starts to look more likely that government workers are not getting paid, or at least there's big delays. So there's at least a month or 2, maybe even the 6 months is accurate. My listener went into great detail about this stuff. I don't want to name his name because he didn't give me permission to, but he has family and friends in tier 3 and tier 4 cities, and he also said that China's strategic pork reserves, that there's no demand for the frozen pork as well. So not only there's a lot of mistakes, a lot of misallocation of capital in China as well. Okay, the US is a mess, China is a mess, the European Union is a mess, and now I think we're getting to the point where over the next 6, 12, 18 months, it's just going to be a question of what crashes first, and then the aftershock, the tsunami after the earthquake. Okay, and what chain reaction happens after the first major earthquake. Okay, guys, thank you for your time. Hopefully you enjoyed this content. Hit the like button. And if you want me to keep busting my butt and looking for research that the rest of the alternative media, including China Uncensored, and many people in the gold community simply will not do because it does not fit the narrative, because the narrative is China is way better than everyone else for a lot of gold bugs, then please think about at least signing up and becoming a monthly PayPal account contributor or a monthly Patreon account contributor. Thank you for your time.